Welcome back to Vintage Camera Digest. Today's episode is the first in a series that I'll be doing on the first wave of autofocus 35mm SLRs that occurred in the mid to late 1980s. And since this is the first in that series, what better camera to start off with than the camera that started it all? The Minolta Maxxum 7000, also known as the Dynax 7000 in parts of the world other than the US. So stick around and let's talk about the Maxxum. Now, I credit Minolta for giving us the first truly successful autofocus SLR, but they weren't really the first to market for autofocus. Interestingly, Konica, who would go on to merge with Minolta in 2003, released the very first autofocus camera, the C35AF, way back in 1977. It was a point-and-shoot compact film camera and not an SLR. The first true autofocus SLR was the Polaroid one-step SX70, which used active sonar to achieve focus. But the SLR form we usually think of when we hear those three letters had its autofocus roots in the 1981 Pentax MEF. The MEF had focus sensors in the body and required a special motorized lens to operate in full auto mode. And as far as I can tell, there was only one lens available. In 1983, Nikon released the F3AF, which was, just as it sounds, an autofocus version of its flagship F3 camera with a special AF finder. And like the Pentax, it required specialized lenses, of which there were only two. In 1985, Canon released the autofocus T80 with three available lenses, but that was marketed as an entry-level camera with only program exposure modes, and neither the Pentax MEF nor the Nikon F3AF, nor the Canon T80 really caught on with consumers. But also in 1985, Minolta unleashed the Maxxum Dynax 7000. And as they say, the rest is history. So how did the Minolta meet with such success and not end up as a footnote like the Pentax, Nikon, and Canon? Because Minolta created an entirely new system based on autofocus. The 7000 wasn't a retrofit of an existing model. It was brand new, created from the ground up as a prosumer, enthusiast level camera with multiple exposure modes. And with it came a brace of great lenses and dedicated accessories. Minolta was all in on the Maxxum at a time when other major camera manufacturers were still trying to decide if this autofocus thing was just a fad. And as it turned out, of course, it was not. But enough backstory, let's get into the camera. The first thing you'll probably notice is the lack of knobs and dials. All functions are controlled by a series of buttons combined with a top LCD panel and laid out in a way that makes sense. On the top left shoulder of the camera, you'll find dedicated buttons for ISO, exposure mode, drive mode, and exposure compensation. On the right shoulder, the shutter speeds are controlled by two up and down buttons situated behind the squarish space-age shutter release. The shutter speed range here is 30 seconds to 1/2000th of a second, plus B. Now, when in manual or shutter priority modes, the shutter speeds are available in full stop increments. For example, 1/60th of a second to 1/125th of a second to 1/250th of a second, and so on. The exception to this is the camera's flash sync speed of 1/100th of a second, which is selectable here. However, in aperture priority and program exposure modes, all the shutter speeds are available in half stops. None of the Maxxum lenses have an aperture ring. Instead, you choose your f-stop in half steps with the two up-down buttons on the left side of the lens mount. This is ideally a good place for this control since they closely mimic the position you'd normally have for an aperture ring. The metering mode for the camera is center-weighted TTL with one silicon photocell on the pentaprism. It also allows for TTL flash exposure for another silicon photocell at the bottom of the mirror box. By the way, if you hear a bell, it's the collar on this cat that won't be still. Anyway, now let's look at the exposure modes. By pressing the mode button and using the up-down buttons behind the shutter release, you can cycle through all the ones we've come to expect. Program, shutter priority, aperture priority, and manual. There's also a dedicated P button near the shutter release that you can use to quickly reset the camera to the default program shooting mode. In each of the different modes, when you look at the top LCD panel, there will be a small arrow that points to the value that you can manually change. For example, in aperture priority, you'll see an arrow that points to the aperture value. In shutter priority, the arrow points to the shutter value. In manual mode, both values are indicated by the arrow, and in program mode, neither is. And speaking of program mode, the camera chooses from 3 different programs based on the lens that's being used. Standard program is used for lenses between 35 to 105 millimeter. With telephoto lenses longer than 105, the program biases toward faster shutter speeds to reduce the likelihood of camera shake. These shutter speeds will range from 1/250th of a second and higher. With wide-angle lenses less than 35 millimeter, the program will bias toward f-stops, rendering greater depth of field. If you're using a zoom lens which can move from one range to another, say the 70 to 210, the program will change based on your chosen focal length. On the back of the camera, you will find the AE lock button and the manual rewind buttons. The camera automatically rewinds at the end of the film roll, but you can trigger the rewind yourself by pressing the R button while sliding the lever to the left. Back over on the top left, you have the drive button. Pressing this button along with the shutter up and down buttons will cycle you through the different drive modes, where the options are single shot, continuous, and self-timer. The ISO button lets you manually input an ISO between 25 and 6400 in 1/3 step increments. The camera also uses DX coding, so manual setting of the ISO isn't required unless you choose to do so. For example, when using non-DX coded film or when you want to push or pull processed film. Now let's look at focusing modes. You'll find the focus switch on the left near the bottom of the lens mount. There are only 2 options, AF and manual. Unlike modern cameras, there is no choosing between single shot or continuous AF modes. When you're in single shot drive mode, the camera uses single shot autofocus. When you're in continuous drive mode, the camera will continue to autofocus on moving subjects as you shoot, and it will not shoot unless the subject is in focus. Now, this continuous autofocus mode is not predictive. That didn't come out on cameras until a few years later. It solved a common problem with early autofocus systems. When a camera autofocuses on a subject moving toward or away from the camera, it's always a little behind the subject, because by the time the camera focuses and you've made the exposure, the subject has continued to move. Predictive AF solved that issue by tracking the subject, analyzing the movement, and calculating where it would be at the instant of exposure. But that was unheard of at the time this camera was released. So I'm kind of curious about how well it actually performs. My guess is that it's not that great, but I've devised a little test to help determine if that's really the case. So let's go check this out. So this video is going to serve as a reference on how I'm going to test older autofocus systems versus newer autofocus systems. So this is the first test that I'm doing, and I'm using it with the Maxxum 7000 camera that came out in 1985. I'm going to put it up against my Canon 90D DSLR just so we can see the difference. I'm going to let the Canon 90D results be the benchmark, and we'll compare the percentages of in focus versus out of focus shots on each of the cameras. In the future, when I get ready to do other older autofocus cameras, which probably won't be that many, but you know, there will be, I've got an EOS 1 that we'll check, an EOS 650, an EOS 630. I've got a Nikon N2020. Those are all videos that are sort of in the pipeline, and I'm going to use the same sort of test for each of those. I'm not going to show this test every video. I'm just going to let this serve as the reference point. What we'll do is, instead of having the subject move toward the camera, I'm going to move the camera toward the subject. Also, we're fairly close in so that the movement is more exaggerated. If the subject were 50 feet away and moved in 5 feet, there wouldn't be that much trouble tracking. So I don't think that would be the best test of that autofocus system. Having the subject close and moving in is going to challenge it a bit more, and that's sort of what I want to do. If you look through the viewfinder of the camera, this is what's going to be going on. Forgive the crappiness of the shot, but that is what the camera is going to be seeing as it goes through this test. So we'll get started with testing the Maxxum first. Let's make sure that it's in focus. So you notice the lag there? The Maxxum 7000 will not fire the shutter unless it thinks it's in focus. So all of that time that it wasn't firing, it was searching for focus. All right, let's go a little bit slower and see if that helps. Got carried away at the end of my run there. All right, again. Ooh, having some trouble there. All right, at the end of the roll, rewind. That was only a 20 exposure roll, and it sounded like it was a 90 exposure roll rewinding there. All right. So I'm gonna put up the Canon next, do a run with it, and then we'll process this film and check out the results. So I've swapped out the old Minolta for a modern Canon DSLR with a 50mm 1.4 on. This is actually a Canon 90D with a Sigma 1.4 art lens. So we're going to test and see what the percentage is of in-focus shots versus out-of-focus shots compared to the Minolta Maxxum 7000. So with the Canon here, I have it set to continuous autofocus at high-speed motor drive. And this will give us a benchmark as we can compare today's autofocus capabilities to that of yesteryear. All right, this is going to be the same test. Start back here. All right. Okay, it'll be interesting to see how many of those were in super sharp focus. So we're going to go process the film from the Maxxum 7000 and check out the results. Well, this is surprising. Out of 24 shots, none were terribly soft. 4 were very sharp, 4 were a little less sharp, and 2 were a little less sharp than that. But these 10, I would say, are acceptably sharp. So 41% are really good, 59% are decent. I really thought we'd get worse percentages than that. So back to the camera controls. On modern cameras such as this one with LCD panels and viewfinder displays, there's usually a decent amount of information displayed in the viewfinder, and the Maxxum 7000 provides that as well. If you take a look at the viewfinder, you'll see that the bottom LCD panel contains your exposure information. It'll show the current shutter speed f-stop combination and whether it's correct for the exposure. The focus area is defined by the small rectangular box in the center of the screen. And in the bottom left, you have your focus confirmation lights. The green LED will light when correct focus is achieved, and either one or both of the 2 red arrows will light if there's a focus problem. You can use this info when focusing manually as well. The example shows that the focusing mark is on the center vase, but you're front focused on the picture to the left. The red arrow points in the direction to turn the lens focusing ring. Here, you'd turn it counterclockwise. If you're back focused relative to the focus mark, the arrow shows you to turn the focus ring clockwise. If both red arrows flash, it indicates a subject that cannot be autofocused for various reasons, such as not enough detail or maybe it's too dark. Also, at the bottom of the viewfinder, you'll see whichever exposure mode you have selected. Metered manual exposure is achieved by taking note of the 2 black arrows between the shutter speed and f-stop. Both will illuminate if the exposure is considered correct. In the case of underexposure, only the bottom arrow that points down will show. In the case of overexposure, only the top one that points up will be visible. If you have any exposure compensation dialed in, you will see it to the right of the shutter speed f-stop combination, and it will display a plus or minus depending on what you have dialed in. And while we're right here, another thing I want to point out is that the Maxxum 7000 has program shift capability. This is handy. For example, the camera gives you a reading in program mode that is 1/15 of a second at 5.6. You can use the shutter buttons to increase the shutter speed to 1/60th to avoid potential camera shake. The f-stop will automatically adjust to compensate, in this case to f2.8. And the P will flash to let you know that program shift is engaged. You can also use the aperture selection buttons near the lens to initiate program shift. Doing this will cause the shutter speed to be adjusted automatically. Looking at the top LCD of the camera, the word program will flash if you've engaged the program shift function. When the camera was released, they also released a full system of accessories along with it. That's one reason it was as successful as it was. There were 3 TTL flashes, a control grip for controlling multiple flashes, 2 program backs, and 4 interchangeable focusing screens. There was the G screen, which was plain matte, the L with a grid, the S with vertical and horizontal scales for scientific uses, and the PM with a split image and microprism. The system also had a variety of controllers, remote cores, eyepiece correction lenses available as well. Now the only thing left to do with this camera is go shoot it. So today we're headed back to Chattanooga, Tennessee and the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum. So let's go. So we're out here this morning at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum in Chattanooga. Today I have the Minolta Maxxum 7000, one of the first successful autofocus cameras that was released this back in 1985. So we've already talked about the camera a little bit, but now we're going to shoot. I've got some Tri-X 400 in here. I've got a couple of rolls, and I'm hoping that we'll get some nice detail machinery type shots out here. Thought it was going to be a little overcast. It may still be, but right now it's we've got a little bit of sun. So let's go see what we can find. I actually have a few lenses. I've got the 51.8. I have a 35 to 70 f4. I have a 70 to 210 f4 and a 28 2.8. I'm sure I won't use all of those, but I've got them because you know that's how I am. All right, so let's go see what we can find. So there's the cart wheels here, the railroad wheels, the train wheels of this, I guess this is some sort of, no, I don't know exactly what it is. I could tell you what it is and somebody would say I'm wrong, and that would be true. But we can get a little bit of the wheels and the machinery underneath here. So you can hear how loud the focusing motor is in this. Cool. And I'm going to crack it just a bit. Make sure I'm not getting any flare. All right, let me get a different angle. This focus is searching just a little bit. All right, so here we have this little sign that says chock for the wheel chock. So I'm going to get an angle down, track a bit, try for some a little shallower depth of field. So I'm going to use top shutter speed on this camera is 1/2000th of a second, so I'm going to use that at f3.5. Cool, I like that. This locomotive looks pretty impressive. I'm going to try to shoot it with the 50. May have to put the 28 on there just to see, but we'll see. No, it fills the frame nicely with the 50. Yeah, I like this composition. Nice and symmetrical. Well, I hope it's symmetrical. It always looks symmetrical in the camera until I get the negatives. Yeah. My vision's a little wonky, I suppose. I'm gonna shoot with I'm gonna put the 28 on there and get the same shot. Get a little bit more grandiose view. Some exaggerated perspective. I get kind of spoiled with the modern autofocus noises because there's not much noise to it. But this, I mean, you hear the gears grinding and when it stops, it sort of gives you a confidence that it is indeed in focus. That's what I'm telling myself anyway. One thing to note about this camera is the viewfinder is really bright and it's sharp. It looks really good through the viewfinder. You know, some of these cameras have viewfinders that are a bit darker, but this one is one of the brighter ones that I found. All right, let's move around and see what else we can shoot. So I'm gonna pose right here. This will be like having a caption file for me. It says dummy right there. Since I've got the 28 on there, I'm going to sort of get this frame within a frame. Make sure I trust the focus. One 2,000th of a second at 5.6. I'd like to have shallower depth of field on that, but I've got 400 speed film in and the top shutter speed is 1/2000th. I don't have any neutral density filters with me, so we're gonna make do with what we've got. This is an interesting piece back here. I wish they didn't have all the please don't climb signs on it, but I can understand why, because if they didn't have that, I would certainly be one that was climbing on it. So that's for me. The sky's a little bit hazy right there, so maybe it won't be totally blown out. So we're going to see what we can get out of this. I still have the 28mm. So I'm metering 1/2000th of a second, 6.7. If you're trying to be discreet and incognito with this camera, you're not going to be able to, because all of these early cameras with the built-in winders are super loud. Let's try some with the 35 to 70 lens. I haven't shot with that yet. I may have to change the batteries in my wireless system here soon. So if the sound goes out, that's what the deal is. Let's try to fire some of these off first. Got an interesting sky there. I've got a couple of more shots. I'm gonna put the 28 back on. Sky's got some nice wispy clouds in it. And sun's good right now. So I keep moving this camera around and no, you can't see what I'm doing. So that was the end of that roll. Rewind. Switch on the back, slide it that way. In case you didn't know that it was rewinding, it's got this quiet rewind system. I wouldn't think it would take that long to rewind 36 exposures, but apparently it did. All right, so let's get this film out, swap it. Right, so I really like how this is nice and painted, and you've got all of these, all of the gears and the pulleys and the weighted systems, and I'm sure none of that is railroad. None of that is railroad lingo for any of this. I think there should be some really good shots in here. Let's go about 6. All right, let's see what else we can find here. I've got about 12 more exposures. Should be able to take that pretty quick. Ooh, This is a nice caboose. Here at the Tennessee Valley Railroad Museum, you can book a short excursion, a couple of hours, goes up the tracks, turns around in the train yard, comes back. And then I don't know if they depart from this particular station, but there are other excursions. I think I saw one where it was as long as an 8-hour trip. I've done that once. It's a really interesting way to travel, because you get to see parts of the countryside you never would see it any other way. So check that out if you're in the Chattanooga area. So I think I'll finish up the roll on the back side of this sleeper car. Like the little gate, it's a little bit of a skew. Some interesting tones there. All right, rewind. See how long it takes this time. So what impressions do I have for the Minolta Maxxum 7000? First, let's talk about the good. I'm really surprised at how much I like this camera. Back when these were first released, I didn't like them. I thought the autofocus was slow and that the camera was clunky, and I never had the opportunity to use one. I didn't really want to. But now I look at it and realize that it has just about everything we've all come to know and love about modern digital cameras. A good variety of exposure modes as well as drive modes. The up-down button interface for choosing modes, shutter speeds, and apertures, etc. is the only thing that betrays its early AF design. After Canon implemented control dials on their cameras instead of buttons and switches, most other makers followed suit. And by the early 1990s, Minolta implemented them as well on all of their cameras. But I think the best accessories for this camera are the lenses. Some of them are really, really nice. Minolta always had a good reputation regarding its manual focus lenses, and they didn't disappoint with their autofocus line either. But now, let's discuss the bad. Autofocus is slow, but fairly accurate, even in continuous mode. So I guess that's not really a negative, but it's nowhere close to what modern cameras offer. There's no PC socket. That's not a deal breaker though. You can just use one of those cheap hot shoe to PC adapters if you really need a PC terminal. Film rewind takes forever, as we saw. And even though the build quality is generally good, these cameras are plagued with deteriorating rubber grips that will happen after so many years. The rubber just breaks down, gets sticky, gets brittle, and can come off in chunks. Now this is not a Minolta specific gripe, although just about every camera they made after this one suffered from it. Even their last professional offering, the Alpha 9. Nikon cameras from the early 90s, as well as some Canons from that period, also have this issue. As a matter of fact, I have a Nikon digital SLR right now that is already afflicted with that sticky grip syndrome. I don't know what kind of rubber these companies were using for these, but it could have been better. If you're in the market for one of these old 7000s, it may be hard to find one with a completely intact grip. Would I recommend a Minolta 7000? Yes, if it's in good shape and cheap. And by cheap, I mean like the $30 to $40 range, with a lens included. These things sold by the thousands, and there are a lot of them out there. But the best reason to pick one of these up is to use the Maxxum system lenses. I do think they are really, really nice. But you don't need this particular model to do that. Any Minolta A-mount body that followed this will work. I actually have a few more Minolta autofocus cameras that are in the queue for an episode here, so hopefully it won't be too long before I can get to those. So thanks for watching. Be sure to drop a like if you enjoyed this Minolta history lesson, and consider subscribing so you won't miss any of the episodes I have coming up. And remember, you miss all the shots you don't take, so keep shooting, and I'll see you next time.